If that bread was meant for the royal table, then why did the starving wolf lower his head like he was thanking her? Tyler Brooks held the cloth bundle high in the steam-filled kitchen, letting everyone see the small loaf, the covered bowl of stew, and the apple Grace Miller had hidden beneath a folded napkin. The kitchen went still around her. Pots hissed over the fire. Flour dust clung to the wooden table. Outside the back door, dusk was already pressing purple shadows against the edge of the pine forest, and Grace could feel every second slipping away like warmth from an open window. She did not reach for the bundle. She did not explain. She only stood with her hands clasped in front of her plain dress, while Tyler smiled, as if he had finally discovered proof that an Omega could be exactly as low as he had always claimed. "Look at this," he said, turning toward the cooks, stable hands, and servants gathered near the hearth. "Hollow Creek prepares to welcome the Alpha King of the North, and our little kitchen Omega steals from the feast before His Majesty even arrives." A few people looked away. A few looked at Grace with the sharp curiosity of those who were grateful the shame belonged to someone else. Her cheeks warmed, but she kept her eyes on the back door. Beyond it, past the chopped wood and the frozen wash barrels, the forest waited. And somewhere under those trees, the black wolf was waiting too. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in courage and destiny, hit like and subscribe. These stories remind us, love finds the broken. Now back to Grace. She had found the wolf 3 nights ago after hearing a sound behind the old feed shed. Not a growl, not a threat, but a breath so weak it made her stop with a bucket in both hands. Most people in Hollow Creek would have run for hunters. Grace had followed the sound. At the tree line, beneath the low branches of a snow-dusted pine, she had seen him, a black wolf larger than any forest animal should have been, his fur dark as a moonless road, his silver eyes open but exhausted. He had not moved toward her. He had not bared his teeth. He had only watched, silent and starving, as if the world had taught him that every approaching hand came with a price. Grace knew that feeling too well, so she had placed a crust of bread on a flat stone and backed away. The wolf had waited until she was several feet off, then eaten with careful, aching dignity. Since then, she had returned each dusk with whatever she could spare. Never enough. Always something. "Answer me," Tyler said, snapping her back into the kitchen. "Were you stealing for yourself?" Grace looked at the bundle, then at the fading light beyond the door. If she denied it, he would ask who the food was for. If she told the truth, they would follow her. And if they followed her, they would see only a dangerous creature where she had seen hunger. "No," she said softly. Tyler laughed. "No? That is your defense." Grace's fingers curled into her skirt. The stew would be cold soon. The wolf had been weaker yesterday, slower to lift his head, his silver eyes dimmer in the dusk. Hollow Creek could decorate its hall with evergreen and polish every silver cup for a king who had not yet arrived. But Grace could not let a living creature starve a few hundred yards from a feast. She stepped forward and reached for the cloth bundle. Tyler pulled it back, amused. "Where do you think you are going?" Grace lifted her chin, fear trembling through her, but not stopping her. "To feed someone who needs it more than we do." Tyler's smile faltered for the smallest moment, not because Grace had spoken loudly, but because she had spoken at all. The kitchen seemed to lean closer. The head cook stopped stirring the pot. One of the stable boys lowered his eyes. Even the fire sounded quieter, as if the room itself understood that something fragile had stepped into the open. Grace kept her hand extended toward the cloth bundle, palm up, waiting. She had spent most of her life in Hollow Creek learning the shape of silence. Silence when someone took credit for her work. Silence when Marissa Vale passed through the kitchen in silk sleeves and wrinkled her nose at the smoke. Silence when Tyler called her useful only because every proud house needed someone to scrub what others spilled. But silence had never saved anything hungry. Tyler glanced at the back door, then at her. "Someone," he repeated. "Who exactly is waiting in the woods for scraps from our king's welcome feast?" Grace felt the room shift again, curiosity sharpening into suspicion. "An animal," she said. It was the safest truth she could offer. Laughter broke from Tyler's friends near the pantry. "An animal," Tyler said, delighted. "So the Omega has been feeding strays while the pack prepares for royalty." He tossed the bundle toward her, not hard, but carelessly enough that the bowl inside nearly slipped. Grace caught it against her chest, relief moving through her so quickly her knees almost weakened. "Go on then," he said. "Feed your animal. But do not think this is over." She did not answer. She moved past him, through the back door, into the cold. The evening air struck her face with the sharp scent of pine and coming snow. Behind the kitchen, Hollow Creek was alive with preparation. Lanterns being lifted, garlands carried across the yard, voices calling for polished silver and fresh candles. Everyone was busy making the pack look worthy of a king no one had seen in years. No one noticed one Omega crossing the frozen grass with a bundle held close beneath her cloak. That was how Grace preferred it. Unseen meant unbothered. Unseen meant she could still do small good things before the world found a reason to stop her. She passed the woodpile, the wash barrels, the old feed shed, and entered the narrow deer path between the pines. Dusk settled deeper there. The sky above the branches glowed violet, and the first evening star appeared like a pinprick in the cold. Grace slowed near the flat stone where she had left food the night before. "It is me," she whispered. "I brought what I could." For a moment, there was only wind. Then the shadows under the largest pine moved. The black wolf stepped into view with a silence that made him seem carved from night itself. He was enormous, even thinner than she remembered, his ribs faint beneath dark fur, his silver eyes fixed on her with a strange, human stillness. Grace's breath caught, but she did not run. She knelt several feet away and unfolded the cloth on the stone. Bread first, then the stew, then the apple, split with a small kitchen knife so he would not have to work so hard for it. "They think I stole it," she said softly, because speaking to him felt easier than speaking to people. "Maybe I did, a little. But wasting food beside a starving mouth seems like a worse kind of theft." The wolf lowered his head to eat. Slowly, carefully, not like a beast snapping at scraps, but like someone trying to remember dignity while accepting mercy. Grace looked away to give him that dignity. In the distance, Hollow Creek's music began, bright and practiced. Here, under the pines, the only sound that mattered was the quiet rhythm of a hungry creature surviving one more night. Grace did not hear Tyler and his friends step onto the deer path behind her. But the wolf did. His silver eyes lifted from the food, and the whole forest seemed to hold its breath. Grace knew the wolf had heard something before she did. The change was almost invisible, a stillness passing through his dark body, a sharper focus in his silver eyes, the food forgotten on the stone between them. Then came the sound of boots on frozen needles, careless and certain, followed by Tyler's low laugh cutting through the pines. "Well," he said, stepping into the clearing with two young pack men behind him, "that is not a stray." Grace rose too quickly, the cold biting through her thin shoes as she moved between Tyler and the wolf. She did not think about it first. Her body simply chose the space where protection was needed. The black wolf remained behind her, silent, massive, and weak enough that the effort of standing seemed to cost him. Tyler noticed. His smile widened with the pleasure of finding something he could turn into a trophy. "Do you have any idea what you have been hiding in our woods?" he asked. "He was hungry," Grace said. Tyler looked past her. "He is dangerous. He has not hurt anyone. Not yet." One of the young men shifted nervously behind Tyler, but Tyler's pride was louder than anyone's caution. "The royal delegation arrives tonight. Imagine the honor if Hollow Creek presents a captured black wolf from the northern border. The Alpha King values strength." Grace felt the words like cold water down her back. Captured, presented, honored. They sounded clean when Tyler said them, dressed in the language of duty, but all she heard was a hungry creature being turned into proof of someone else's importance. She tightened her hands at her sides. "You are not taking him." Tyler's eyes snapped to her, amused and insulted all at once. "You are giving orders now?" "No," Grace said, voice trembling but clear. "I am asking you to leave him alone." The forest held the sentence for a heartbeat. Then Tyler laughed again, but it came out thinner than before. "Move, Grace." She did not. The wolf's breath warmed the back of her skirt, slow and uneven. Somehow that small sign of trust made her braver than anger ever could. She thought of every morning she had fed people who never looked at her face. Every evening she had carried scraps to animals no one noticed. Every time kindness had been called weakness because it did not wear a crown or carry a title. "If you want to impress a king," she said, "try mercy." The words stunned even her. Tyler's face hardened with embarrassment, and the two men behind him exchanged uncertain glances. From the pack house, music floated faintly through the trees, bright and foolish against the growing dark. The first edge of moonlight slipped between the branches, touching the clearing in pale silver. The black wolf lifted his head. Grace felt the air change before she understood why. The wind stilled. The shadows drew inward around him, not frightening, not wild, but solemn, as if the forest itself had recognized a presence it had been waiting to honor. Tyler took one step back. "What is happening?" he whispered. Grace turned just enough to see the wolf fully. His silver eyes were no longer dim. They burned with quiet command. The moonlight moved over his dark fur like water over black stone, and for one breath he looked at Grace, not as an animal looks at a stranger, but as a man looks at the only soul who came close when he had nothing to offer. Then the darkness around him folded, softened, and lifted. Grace shielded her eyes from the sudden silver glow. When it faded, the starving wolf was gone. In his place stood a tall, white-skinned man wrapped in the remnants of a torn black cloak, broad-shouldered, pale with exhaustion, and colder in his stillness than any winter night. His silver eyes moved past Tyler, past the others, and settled on Grace with unmistakable recognition. Tyler dropped to one knee so fast the frozen needles scattered. The men behind him followed. "Your Majesty," Tyler breathed. Grace could not move. The man behind her, the one she had fed with stolen bread and kitchen stew, was King Alexander Frostbane, Alpha King of the North. And the first thing he did with his returned human voice was speak to her. "Grace Miller," he said, quiet but absolute. "You were the only one who saw hunger before power." Grace heard Tyler whisper the royal title, but her mind could not fit the words around the man standing before her. The clearing had become too still, the moonlight too bright, the cold too sharp against her face. King Alexander Frostbane swayed once, barely enough for anyone else to notice. But Grace saw it because she had spent 3 nights watching the black wolf hide weakness behind dignity. His shoulders were broad beneath the torn cloak, his posture controlled, his silver eyes fierce with command, yet exhaustion clung to him like frost. Before she could stop herself, she stepped toward him. "You need to sit down," she said. Tyler made a strangled sound from the ground. "Grace, that is the Alpha King." Alexander's gaze did not leave her. "She knows I am tired." The simple sentence silenced the clearing more completely than any roar could have. Grace's cheeks warmed, but she did not look away. "You were starving 10 minutes ago." One of the young men made a tiny noise of disbelief. Tyler's head snapped toward her as if he expected the king to punish such plain speech. Instead, Alexander's mouth softened at the edge, not quite a smile, but close enough to make Grace's heart stumble. "I was," he said, "and you fed me." The words turned the bundle of bread and stew on the stone into something sacred. Grace looked down at it, suddenly aware of how small her offering had been. A stolen loaf, a bowl of kitchen stew, an apple split with a dull knife. Nothing royal, nothing worthy of a king. Alexander seemed to understand the thought before she spoke it. "Do not make your mercy smaller because the world taught you to apologize for it." Grace's throat tightened. Tyler shifted on his knees, eager to recover ground. "Your Majesty, Hollow Creek had no knowledge of your condition. Had we known, we would have sent guards, healers, the finest provisions from the hall." Alexander finally looked at him, and the clearing chilled in a way that had nothing to do with weather. "That is precisely the point." Tyler went still. "I do not understand." "No," Alexander said quietly. "You looked at hunger and saw an opportunity. She looked at hunger and saw a life." The two young men lowered their heads. Grace felt the force of those words move through her, not like praise, but like someone lifting a weight she had carried so long she had mistaken it for part of herself. Alexander turned slightly, and his balance faltered again. This time Grace moved without asking permission from fear. She took the cloak bundle from the ground, shook out the cleanest corner, and held it toward him. "Please sit. Just for a minute." Tyler drew in a breath, scandalized by the idea of a king sitting on frozen pine needles. Alexander did not seem offended. He sat on the flat stone where the food had been, slow and controlled, as if accepting help required more courage than giving orders. Grace crouched a few feet away, close enough to offer the stew, far enough to give him dignity. He accepted the bowl with both hands. In the moonlight, she saw faint silver markings along his wrist, fading like frost under sunrise. "What happened to you?" she asked softly. Alexander looked toward the dark northern trees. For the first time, the cold king seemed not cruel or distant, but very alone. "Someone in my route betrayed the border path. A binding charm caught me between forms. In wolf shape, I could not speak. In human shape, I could not remain long enough to reach help. Every patrol I approached saw only a black wolf and reached for chains." His eyes returned to hers. "Until you." Grace thought of the first night, the way he had waited for her to step back before eating, as if even starving, he refused to frighten her. "I did not know who you were. That is why it mattered." Behind them, festival music rose again from Hollow Creek. Unaware that the king they were waiting to impress sat in the forest with a kitchen omega and a half-empty bowl of stew. Alexander heard it too. His expression hardened, but when he looked at Grace, his voice remained gentle. "Will you walk with me to your pack hall?" Grace glanced toward Tyler, still kneeling in the snow-dusted needles, his face pale with dread. For once, the path back did not feel like returning to shame. It felt like carrying the truth into a room that had polished every surface except its heart. She stood, and Alexander rose beside her, taller than every story, colder than the northern mountains, yet careful when he offered his arm. Grace placed her hand lightly on his sleeve, and together they turned toward Hollow Creek, where everyone was still waiting for the Alpha King to arrive. The path back to Hollow Creek seemed to change beneath Grace's feet, though the same frozen needles covered the ground, and the same purple dusk hung between the pines. She had walked this trail dozens of times with her shoulders lowered and her hands full of scraps, hoping no one would ask where she had been. Now she walked beside King Alexander Frostbane, her fingers resting lightly on his sleeve, while Tyler and the two young men followed several paces behind in a silence so heavy it almost had weight. Alexander's steps were steady, but Grace could feel the effort beneath his control. He had returned to human form, yet the binding charm had left traces in him, a faint rasp in his breathing, a careful pace. The way his silver eyes sometimes narrowed, as if holding back pain he refused to name. She wanted to ask if he needed to stop again, but she also understood dignity. So she matched his pace without drawing attention to it. The trees thinned. Lanterns appeared ahead, warm and golden around the pack hall. Music spilled into the yard, bright with fiddles and polished cheer. Hollow Creek had made itself beautiful for a king it had not recognized when he was hungry. Grace felt Alexander's arm tense beneath her hand as they reached the edge of the light. The front doors of the hall stood open. Inside, long tables gleamed with silver dishes, fresh bread, roasted vegetables, sugared fruit, and more food than the forest wolf had seen in 3 nights. Marissa Vale stood near the entrance in a pale blue gown, smiling toward the road where the royal carriage was supposed to arrive. Then she saw Grace first. Her smile sharpened with irritation. "Grace," she said under her breath, but the word carried. "Why are you coming through the front?" Conversation began to fade. One by one, people turned. The head cook froze with a tray in her hands. The elders shifted from annoyance to confusion. Marissa's gaze moved from Grace's plain dress to the tall man beside her, and whatever insult she had prepared died before it reached her tongue. Alexander stepped fully into the lantern light. The hall went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that recognizes power before titles are spoken. Then Elder Hammond, leader of Hollow Creek, dropped to one knee. "Your Majesty." Chair scraped. Cups lowered. Silk rustled. Within seconds, the entire hall bowed, including Marissa, including the servants, including those who had watched Tyler shame Grace in the kitchen and said nothing. Grace remained standing because Alexander's arm under her hand did not lower. His voice moved through the hall, calm and cold. "You prepared a feast for my arrival." Elder Hammond lifted his head just enough to answer. "Yes, Your Majesty. Hollow Creek is honored beyond measure." Alexander looked toward the tables. "And yet the only food that reached me came wrapped in a kitchen cloth." The words landed softly, but every face changed. Tyler had entered behind them. Grace heard his breath catch. Marissa looked from Alexander to Grace, confusion turning slowly into alarm. Elder Hammond swallowed. "I do not understand." Alexander released Grace's hand only to take the empty cloth bundle from her. He held it up, not like evidence of theft, but like a banner of truth. Grace Miller brought bread and stew to the forest because she saw hunger where others would have seen inconvenience. She did not know my name. She did not know my crown. She gave because something living needed care. Grace's throat tightened. The same cloth Tyler had raised to shame her was now held by the king before the entire pack. The room seemed to tilt around that reversal. Alexander turned his silver gaze across the hall. Tell me, Hollow Creek, which welcome matters more to the north? The feast prepared for a throne, or the meal given to a starving stranger in the dark? No one answered. No one could. Grace felt the old humiliation loosen inside her, thread by thread, as the people who had dismissed her finally saw the shape of what they had ignored. For several breaths, Hollow Creek could not find its voice. The great hall that had been filled with music and polished laughter now held only the quiet crackle of candles and the uncomfortable sound of truth settling over every table. Grace stood beside Alexander beneath the lanterns, feeling the eyes that had once slid past her now fixed on her face, her plain dress, her work-worn hands. She wanted to hide from the attention, but Alexander did not let the room make her smaller. He stood close enough that his presence became a wall against their judgment, yet not so close that it swallowed her place in the moment. Elder Hammond rose slowly, his face pale with embarrassment. Your Majesty, had we known you were in distress, we would have emptied our stores for you. Alexander's gaze remained cold. You should not need a crown to recognize need. The sentence moved through the hall like winter air under a door. Marissa lowered her eyes. Several servants looked at the floor. Tyler stood near the entrance, hands clenched, trying to appear loyal while the very cloth he had used to shame Grace lay in the king's hand. She took food without permission, Tyler said at last, his voice careful but strained. I only defended the honor of the feast. Grace felt the old fear rise, the instinct to apologize before anyone asked. But then Alexander turned toward her, not Tyler. Did you take it for yourself? He asked. Grace shook her head. No, did you know who I was? No. Would you have fed me if I had remained only a starving wolf? Her answer came without hesitation. Yes. Alexander looked back at the hall. Then her act was honest. Tyler's face tightened. Honest does not change rank. A murmur stirred, then vanished when Alexander stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Rank did not feed me. Beauty did not feed me. Ceremony did not feed me. Grace Miller did. The room went still again, but this time the silence belonged to her. It gathered around her name and carried it farther than any whisper of shame ever had. Alexander handed the cloth bundle back to Grace with careful respect, as if returning something valuable. This belongs to you, he said. Grace accepted it with trembling fingers. The fabric was ordinary, patched at one corner, faintly scented with bread and smoke. Yet in that moment, it felt heavier than silver. Elder Hammond bowed his head. Miss Miller, Hollow Creek owes you an apology. Grace looked toward the kitchen doorway, where the head cook stood with one hand pressed to her chest. She thought of mornings before dawn, of aching wrists, of leftovers counted more carefully than her hours, of every small kindness she had hidden because no one considered it worthy of notice. An apology is a beginning, she said softly. But the next hungry creature should not have to be a king before someone cares. No one answered, because there was nothing to answer against. Alexander's expression shifted, barely, but Grace felt it like warmth through cold glass. Pride, perhaps, or recognition. He turned to Elder Hammond. Tyler Brooks will give his account to my guards and to your council. He will also explain why he followed an Omega into the woods to turn mercy into spectacle. Tyler's confidence finally gave way to silence. There was no dramatic collapse, no wild protest. Only the small ending of a man discovering that cruelty sounded weak when no crowd applauded it. Alexander faced Grace again, and this time his voice softened enough that it seemed to belong only partly to the hall. The North does not forget a hand extended in darkness. He removed the black cloak from his shoulders, the torn one that still carried pine scent and moonlit cold, and placed it around Grace. Gasps moved through the room. Grace stood beneath its weight, stunned by the warmth. By the way, every eye now understood she had been covered not because she was pitted, but because she was honored. Walk with me to the northern table, Alexander said. Not behind me, beside me. Grace looked at the long table prepared for royalty, at the empty chair nearest the king's place, at the pack that had once kept her in the kitchen. Then she gathered the cloak around her shoulders and took the first step. Grace had crossed the Hollow Creek Hall 1,000 times carrying trays, buckets, folded linens, and apologies she had never owed. She knew which floorboards creaked near the hearth, which corner collected smoke when the chimney draft failed, which tables belonged to elders, and which benches were left for people no one expected to notice. But she had never walked through the center of that room with a king beside her and every head lowered in silence. Alexander moved slowly, not because he lacked command, but because he was still recovering from whatever spell had trapped him in wolf form. Grace sensed the strain beneath his composure, so she matched him without making it obvious, letting the room believe he was guiding her while quietly giving him the pace he needed. The northern table waited beneath the tallest window, set with polished silver and dark blue cloth embroidered with the crest of Frostbane. Marissa Vale stood nearby, frozen in her pale gown, the seat she had clearly expected to claim, now empty beside the king's place. Her perfume drifted through the air, sharp and floral, but her voice had lost every practiced sweetness. "Your Majesty," she said carefully. "Surely Miss Miller would be more comfortable with the household staff. She has always preferred simple places." Grace's fingers tightened once around the edge of Alexander's cloak. Simple places. That was what they called corners when they wanted to make hiding sound like kindness. Alexander turned his silver eyes toward Marissa. Did she prefer them, or was she placed there until she learned not to ask for more? Marissa's silence answered more clearly than words. Alexander pulled out the chair beside his own, not the far chair, not the servant's stool near the wall, but the honored seat at his right hand. He did not command Grace to sit. He waited. The choice, small as it was, opened something painful and bright in her chest. Grace sat slowly, feeling the room rearrange itself around that single act. The head cook wiped her eyes near the kitchen door. One of the stable boys smiled before quickly lowering his face. Elder Hammond looked as if he had aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. Alexander took his place beside her, and only then did the hall sit. Servants approached with food, but Grace noticed the hesitation in their hands. They had served nobles all night with ease. Now they did not know how to serve the omega they had worked beside that morning. Grace reached for the bread basket herself, not to prove humility, but because hunger should not wait for pride to become comfortable. She broke a loaf in half and set one piece near Alexander's plate. His gaze flicked to it, and for one quiet second the great hall vanished. They were back under the pines, with stew on a flat stone and moonlight touching black fur. "Thank you," he said, low enough that only she heard. Grace's cheeks warmed. "You are welcome." Across the table, Elder Hammond cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, Hollow Creek would be honored to provide healers, guards, and lodging until your full strength returns." Alexander looked at the elder, then at the feast, then at Grace's patched cloth bundle resting beside her plate. "I will accept lodging for my guards. As for my recovery, Miss Miller has already proven she understands care better than this hall understands ceremony." Grace looked down quickly, overwhelmed by the sudden weight of being named with respect. Alexander's voice softened. "Grace, after tonight, I will return north. My court must know what happened at the border, and the binding charm must be traced." She heard the unspoken danger in that sentence, but he did not dress it in fear. "I would ask you to come with me," he continued. The hall seemed to stop breathing. Grace lifted her eyes. "As what?" The question slipped out before she could hide it. A servant? A witness? A curiosity? A kitchen omega who had accidentally fed a king? Alexander did not flinch from the hurt beneath it. "As my honored guest," he said. "As the woman whose kindness reached me when my own crown could not. And only if you choose." The word choose moved through Grace like the first warm light after a long winter. Hollow Creek had given her tasks, corners, warnings, and limits. No one had given her choice and meant it. She looked toward the kitchen, then toward the forest beyond the window, where the last dusk had changed everything. "I am afraid," she admitted. Alexander's answer came steady and gentle. "Then we will not pretend you are not. We will simply make sure fear does not decide for you." Grace breathed in slowly, the cloak warm around her shoulders, the bread between them still fragrant from the royal feast that had never fed the starving wolf. For the first time, Leaving did not feel like being cast out. It felt like being invited into a life large enough to hold her. She met Alexander's silver gaze and gave the smallest nod. I will go north. They left Hollow Creek before sunrise, when the great hall candles had burned low and the forest beyond the windows had turned from black to blue. Grace carried only one small bag, the patched cloth bundle folded carefully on top, and the black northern cloak around her shoulders. No one tried to stop her. Some stood in the yard with lowered eyes, offering apologies that sounded like footsteps arriving after the door had already closed. Grace accepted them with quiet grace, not because the words healed everything, but because she did not want to carry bitterness into the north. Alexander waited beside a dark carriage marked with the frostbane crest, his face pale in the morning cold but steadier than the night before. A healer from his guard had wrapped his wrist where the last silver markings of the binding charm still faded, and though he stood tall, Grace noticed how carefully he held himself. She had learned to see need in the spaces people try to hide it. You should ride inside, she said softly. So should you, he replied. She almost smiled. I was not the one trapped between forms. His silver eyes rested on her, and the cold king looked, for a moment, almost human enough to be embarrassed by concern. Then we will both ride inside. The carriage door opened, and Alexander stepped back to let her enter first, not as a servant, not as a rescued burden, but as someone whose comfort mattered. The road north was long and quiet. Hollow Creek disappeared behind pine ridges and pale morning fog, and with every mile, Grace felt the life she knew loosen its grip. She expected fear to grow as the familiar vanished. Instead, something gentler unfolded. The northern guards did not stare at her patched sleeves. The healer asked before checking Alexander's wrist. The driver stopped at noon near a frozen creek so everyone could eat, and when Grace began gathering cups out of habit, Alexander's voice stopped her. You are not here to serve us. She looked down at the cups, startled by how deeply the words struck. I know, she said, though she did not fully. He seemed to understand. Knowing takes practice. That evening, the Frostbane capital appeared beyond a valley of snow-covered firs, its black stone towers rising against the winter sky, stern and beautiful, lit by hundreds of small golden windows. Grace pressed one hand to the carriage glass. It did not look like a place made for girls who had slept near kitchen fires and counted scraps before feeding themselves. It looked ancient, watchful, impossible. Alexander sat across from her, the last of the dusk turning his pale face silver. Does it frighten you? He asked. Yes. Good, he said, surprising her. Fear means you understand the door is large. Courage means you walk through anyway. At the citadel gates, people gathered in silence as the carriage entered. They bowed to Alexander first, then looked toward Grace with open curiosity. She braced for judgment, but Alexander stepped down and turned back, offering his hand. The courtyard watched. Grace placed her fingers in his, and he helped her down as if the eyes of the north were not a burden he meant to make her carry alone. A little boy near the front whispered, Is she the one who fed the wolf? His mother hushed him, but Grace heard no cruelty in the question, only wonder. Alexander heard it too. He looked across the courtyard and said, She is the one who fed a stranger when the world forgot mercy. The words moved through the people like warmth through winter glass. Heads bowed again, lower this time. Grace stood beneath the northern cloak, her small bag in one hand, Alexander's steady hand in the other, and understood that the bread she had carried into the woods had become something larger than food. It had become a key, not to a throne, not to a crown, but to a place where kindness would no longer have to hide in the dark. That night, Frostbane's citadel opened its eastern hall, not for a feast of polished pride, but for a quieter ceremony beneath winter banners and candlelight. Grace stood near the tall windows with Alexander's cloak still around her shoulders, watching snow drift beyond the glass like torn pieces of moonlight. The hall smelled of cedar smoke, warm bread, and pine resin, and for once those scents did not belong to a kitchen where she was expected to work unseen. They belonged to a table where a place had been set for her. Northern nobles, guards, healers, and servants gathered in respectful rows, their voices low, their eyes curious but careful. Alexander stood before them in formal black, his strength returned enough to make the room feel anchored around him. though Grace still noticed the faint shadow beneath his eyes. He had spent the afternoon with his council, tracing the binding charm, sending riders to secure the border, giving orders with the cold precision that made people remember he was king. But when he looked at her, that coldness eased, not disappearing, but becoming something steady enough to rest beside. A servant approached Grace with a silver tray of bread, then hesitated as if unsure whether to offer it to her or wait for instruction. Grace reached for one small loaf and held it in both hands. The hall quieted almost at once. Perhaps they remembered the story already spreading through the citadel. Perhaps they understood that bread had become the language of this strange new destiny. Grace walked to Alexander and placed the loaf on the table between them. "No one should go hungry outside a full hall," she said softly. Alexander's gaze held hers, and the entire room seemed to listen through him. "Then let that be the first law we make in your honor." A murmur moved through the crowd, not shock, but reverence. Grace blinked, overwhelmed. "I do not need a law named for me." "No," Alexander said, "but the forgotten need proof that mercy is not charity. It is duty." He turned to the hall, his voice carrying without force. "From this night forward, every pack under the Northern Crown will keep food, shelter, and aid at its borders for any traveler, any child, any creature in need. No one will be asked to prove rank before receiving care." Grace felt the words enter the room and change it. Not magically, not with silver light or ancient songs. With simple justice, spoken clearly enough that no one could pretend not to understand. The patched cloth bundle lay folded beside her plate, ordinary and worn, yet more powerful than every polished cup around it. Alexander lifted it gently. "This cloth carried the meal that saved my life," he said. "But more than that, it carried the truth of the woman who gave it." Grace's breath caught as he placed the bundle back into her hands. "You may have arrived here as my guest," he said, softer now, "but you will never be treated as an accident in my court." The room bowed, not to the cloak, not to a title she had never asked for. To her. Grace thought of Hollow Creek's kitchen, of Tyler's laughter, of the black wolf lowering his head over stew in the dusk. She thought of every small mercy she had hidden because no one valued what did not shine. Then she looked at the Alpha King of the North, the man who had worn hunger without cruelty and power without needing to crush what stood near him. "Then let this court remember something too," she said. "A full table means nothing if kindness stops at the door." Alexander's silver eyes warmed in the candlelight. "It will remember." Outside, snow covered the roads leading south, softening the tracks from Hollow Creek, but not erasing them. Grace did not need them erased. They had brought her here. And as the eastern hall filled with quiet agreement, warm bread, and winter light, she understood that destiny had not rewarded her for feeding a king. It had revealed a truth she had carried all along. The smallest kindness, given in the dark, can teach an entire kingdom how to see.